Imagine waking up one morning and finding your hometown gone. No trace on a map, no mail delivered, no names spoken aloud. Just fences, silence, and a government that insists it never existed. It began, as most disappearances do, quietly. In the valley below the Appalachian ridgeline, the small town of Morrow Creek, Tennessee lived an ordinary life. It had a post office, 2 schools, a diner with a neon sign that hummed through the night, and a population of just under 3,000. Farmers rose before dawn. Children chased fireflies near the riverbank. And then, in the spring of 1943, the trains stopped stopping there. At first, no one thought much of it. Wartime America was full of oddities, rationing, secrecy, the occasional detour of a convoy through quiet back roads. But then the letters stopped coming back. A young soldier stationed overseas wrote home to his mother in Morrow Creek, only to have the envelope returned, stamped undeliverable, address unknown. Within weeks, surveyors appeared, men in plain clothes, not soldiers, but government contractors, began measuring plots, marking trees with red paint, and handing out forms that few locals could understand. They said it was for a national project. No one knew which one. The last newspaper that mentioned Morrow Creek was dated May 14, 1943. After that, its name disappeared entirely from every public record, census document, and transportation route. Train conductors said their schedules were revised. Maps printed after that summer contained a new patch of federal land. Locals were told to relocate for the war effort. Some moved willingly, believing they were helping America win. Others resisted, only to find their houses condemned by executive order. Within 3 months, the entire valley was fenced off, its roads patrolled, its buildings dismantled or buried beneath new construction. By the time the first frost arrived that year, the lights of Morrow Creek no longer shone from the ridge. Travelers who once passed through now found only warning signs: no trespassing, federal property. No one ever said what had replaced it, and no one, not even the map makers, dared to ask. By the time Morrow Creek vanished from the Tennessee Valley, its disappearance was already written in a language only a handful of men could read. The papers weren't labeled top secret. They didn't need to be. They were buried under layers of bureaucracy, signed in offices where sunlight never reached, where silence was policy and memory was considered a threat. It began, as all great vanishing acts do, with a single signature. In a dim office in Washington, D.C., early 1943, a memo arrived stamped Special Relocation Project Southeast Division. No department, no sender, just initials and a date. Inside, the single directive. Effective immediately, all residents within Grid 14T are to be evacuated under Federal Acquisition Authority. Justification: national security. Purpose: undisclosed.
That grid corresponded exactly to the coordinates of Morrow Creek. No one in the local government had seen anything like it. County officials received sealed envelopes marked confidential. They were told not to speak to the press, not to inform the church boards, and most of all, not to use the town's name outside authorized conversation. When the county recorder asked who had approved the order, the reply came from a faceless Washington voice on a secure line. Don't ask questions you don't want to write answers to. That was the first rule of the new America being built in wartime. Some places had to disappear so others could survive. If you stacked every form, requisition, and security clearance connected to Morrow Creek, it would stand taller than the church steeple that once marked the center of town. Each one signed by a different hand, none belonging to anyone who would ever set foot there. The machinery of secrecy was both immense and invisible. Contracts were routed through dummy corporations, such as Cumberland Supply Co., Appalachian Construction, Eastern Materials Group. each nothing more than a rented office and a single telephone. Behind them stood men in tailored suits who never gave last names, who called their assignments federal assistance programs, and who smiled too easily when asked what they were building. The truth was that America was constructing its first invisible cities. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, just over 200 miles away, had already become a ghost town in plain sight. Overnight, the valley filled with soldiers, scientists, and barbed wire. Maps erased it. Residents were sworn to secrecy. Even the mail was routed through Knoxville with false return addresses. And yet, deep beneath the smokestacks and rail lines, men in white coats were building the foundation of something the world had never seen: the atomic age. What most people didn't know was that Oak Ridge wasn't alone. Marrow Creek was one of 5 shadow towns scattered across the country, as one classified memo later revealed, used for material testing, logistics, and, in some cases, psychological experiments on population relocation. It wasn't just steel and science being tested, it was obedience. The enforcers of silence. The orders came down through men who didn't wear uniforms but carried the same authority as generals. They arrived in black government sedans, dressed not like soldiers but like accountants, their briefcases full of non-disclosure forms and relocation agreements. Each document came with an incentive: compensation for property, transportation assistance, and a promise that the town's cooperation would help win the war. Most signed. Those who didn't found themselves under emergency wartime statutes. The sheriff's deputies, themselves sworn to secrecy, escorted families out of their homes under the watch of federal agents who refused to identify themselves. One resident, Harold Denton, a machinist, later told his grandson, "They didn't shout, they didn't threaten, they just waited until you said yes. Like gravity, patient and certain."
When the last family left, the agents posted a notice on the town hall door: "Property of the United States government. Access restricted." Within days, bulldozers arrived, not to destroy, but to bury. The church was dismantled, stone by stone. The schoolhouse windows were boarded, the bell removed and melted down for scrap. Even the cemetery was sealed behind a chain-link fence, its headstones quietly unmarked in the new survey maps. Inside the National Archives today, in a folder labeled Declassified 1974, there lies a single hand-drawn blueprint. It shows the outline of a small valley intersected by 2 rivers and a grid of 12 streets. At the top, written in pencil, are the words, "Proposed Site B, Auxiliary Operations Facility." No mention of Marrow Creek, but on the lower corner of the map, faintly erased, someone had written, "Existing settlement to be cleared." Historians believe Facility B was part of the logistical chain supporting Oak Ridge and Hanford, key nodes in the Manhattan Project. While Oak Ridge purified uranium and Hanford bred plutonium, smaller sites like Marrow Creek stored and tested the chemical byproducts, maintaining cover by pretending to be standard agricultural or utility projects. That's why no one was allowed back. It wasn't just the secrecy, it was the soil itself. Even decades later, radiation readings in the valley showed higher than normal levels, though never enough to prompt official acknowledgement. Not everyone kept quiet. In 1946, after the war ended, Captain Edwin L. Fraser, an Army engineer stationed in Knoxville, wrote an unsigned letter to the Washington Evening Star. "There are towns you will never find on a map because they were never meant to exist after their job was done. We built them, used them, then buried them. We called it progress." The letter was never published. The editor who received it was later hired by a government communications office. Fraser resigned within months,
disappearing from military records entirely by 1948. Declassified FBI notes mention him only once under a cryptic reference, individual possibly connected to operations in Grid 14T, unverified. It's the only surviving clue that anyone inside the system ever tried to speak out. The silence machine. By the 1950s, America had become a master of institutional amnesia. Entire programs were compartmentalized into numbers, acronyms, and code names. Employees worked on single tasks, never knowing what they contributed to. A secretary might type requisitions for industrial coolant materials, unaware that she was funding nuclear separation plants. A truck driver might haul barrels labeled machinery lubricant, unaware they contained the residues of uranium processing. Everyone played their part, and no one saw the whole picture. That's how Morrow Creek vanished. Not in a storm or fire, but through paperwork, through layers of stamped approval that erased a living community without ever naming it. And when the forms were filed, the offices cleaned out, and the project codes retired, the valley was left to rot under federal custody. For 30 years, even aerial photography blacked out the area. The government listed it as undeveloped woodland, but hunters who strayed too far told stories of cracked pavement beneath the leaves, of light poles without bulbs, of the faint shape of a cross pressed into the dirt where the church once stood. In 1978, a Freedom of Information Act request by a journalist named Marjorie Tuttle finally cracked the surface. She discovered a shipping ledger labeled Appalachian Supply Route 1943. Among its entries were mundane items like steel rivets, copper wire, and rubber hoses. But one caught her eye: 27 crates civilian relocation materials, classified. That single line led her to a chain of correspondence between the War Production Board and the Army Corps of Engineers discussing temporary removal of non-essential populations in key logistical zones.
She traced the coordinates, compared them to modern maps, and realized something shocking. The zone aligned perfectly with the missing town of Morrow Creek. Her article, "The Town the War Forgot," was published in 1979, briefly. 2 weeks later, the paper retracted it, citing editorial inaccuracies. Marjorie Tuttle moved to Maine shortly after. Her notes disappeared when her home office burned in 1981. Echoes in the present. Today, satellite imagery shows faint rectangular patterns beneath the soil, the ghost of a grid once alive with human rhythm. Researchers using ground-penetrating radar have identified structural remains, concrete basements, fragments of porcelain insulators, and traces of electrical wiring consistent with 1940s utilities. But no official acknowledgement has ever come. The Department of Energy, when asked, issues the same statement. Records pertaining to non-active sites prior to 1945 are incomplete or unavailable. Locals still whisper about the valley that hums. On humid nights, they say you can hear a low vibration, like the echo of machinery buried beneath the dirt. Scientists call it nonsense, but the people who grew up near those hills know better. They remember when the government trucks rolled in and the fences went up. Behind every form and file was a family, displaced, disoriented, and forgotten. Many never received full compensation. Their property deeds were marked void due to federal appropriation, a phrase that offered no comfort, only confusion. Children were told not to mention where they came from. Birth certificates listed place of origin unknown. A generation grew up without a hometown, citizens of nowhere. Some survivors gathered once a year in nearby Kingston, lighting candles for the valley they lost. They called it the Silent Reunion. No speeches, no music, just names read aloud, each followed by a pause long enough to feel the weight of what was taken. One elderly woman, the daughter of a displaced teacher, said,
They told us it was for victory, but victory doesn't feel like home. Merrill Creek never returned to the maps. Its coordinates lie under federal land managed by the Department of Energy, off-limits, patrolled, quiet. Only in declassified whispers and fading memories does it still exist. Because sometimes the greatest monuments America builds are the ones it buries. A vanished town doesn't die. It breathes under the dirt, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. For decades after the fences went up around Merrow Creek, the land lay silent, fenced, patrolled, and marked federal property, no trespassing. But silence has its limits. Time, rain, and memory began to work together, peeling back the cover of secrecy that the government had so carefully laid. By the late 1960s, a new kind of explorer arrived. Not treasure hunters or conspiracy chases, but historians with flashlights, notebooks, and curiosity sharpened by rumor. They came because of the maps. Old railroad blueprints didn't match the new ones. Census data from 1940 showed a town that had vanished by 1945. High voltage lines appeared on federal surveys with no listed endpoint. And one retired engineer, known only as Mr. Barlow, had told a journalist that the valley was hollow underneath. The first modernized to see Merrow Creek again belonged to Dr. Susan Heller, an archaeologist from the University of Tennessee. In 1972, she led a small research team to survey abandoned coal tunnels in the region and accidentally stepped into history. While following what she thought was a drainage route, she noticed the ground shift into rectangular formations. It looked too neat, she later recalled, too deliberate to be nature. As her crew dug into the topsoil, their shovels hit brick, then glass, then a rusted metal sign, its letters nearly gone. But faintly, under the corrosion, she made out Creek Public School, District 2. That was the first physical proof that Merrow Creek had once existed, the first object to whisper, "We were here." The discovery made no headlines. Dr. Heller was advised by her department not to pursue further investigation due to ownership complications. The land, she learned, still belonged to the Department of Energy, an agency that didn't exist when the town was erased. Its boundary lines, however, matched perfectly with the wartime map of Grid 14T. Over the next 2 decades, pieces of the lost town surfaced like bones in thawing soil. Construction crews found fragments of porcelain insulators when laying new power lines. Hikers stumbled across paved streets overgrown with moss, their painted lane markings still faintly visible in the right light. Metal detectors picked up steel piping and bolts buried too deeply to be from any modern project. Each discovery told a story of precision, the kind only military engineers of the 1940s possessed. One particularly eerie find came in 1983 when a local farmer's plow unearthed a small bronze plaque. It read, "For service rendered, Merrow Creek Civil Defense Committee, 1942.
But Merrow Creek had supposedly been erased by 1943. So how did a Civil Defense Committee exist a year before the town was destroyed? Historians later theorized that the committee was a cover, a civilian front established to coordinate local compliance with government relocation orders. Neighbors spying on neighbors, keeping track of who resisted evacuation. A system of quiet coercion, built not with force, but with familiarity. In 1991, satellite imagery, publicly available for the first time, showed a faint cruciform outline in the center of the fenced area. Researchers initially assumed it was a geological pattern, but one historian, Elias Monroe, overlaid a 1930s survey map on the same coordinates and realized the shape matched perfectly with St. Michael's Church, the only stone building known to exist in Merrow Creek. He arranged a special permit to enter the area, citing environmental soil analysis. Beneath 10 inches of dirt and decades of decay, he found what remained of the church's foundation. a fragment of stained glass, blue and red shards like frozen light, the rusted hinge of a bell frame, and buried near the altar, a small box containing yellowed letters, all addressed simply to Dear God. They were written by townspeople in the final weeks before the evacuation. One, by a teacher named Evelyn Grace, read, "We don't understand what they are building, but they say it will save lives. Please let them be right. Please let this not be the end of us." When Monroe read that line aloud during a university presentation, the audience went silent. Even decades later, the emotion of those words reached through time like a pulse, a reminder that what the government called relocation was, to those who lived it, a quiet extinction. By the early 2000s, the story of Marrow Creek had shifted from conspiracy to curiosity. Documentaries, podcasts, and late-night TV specials speculated about the lost atomic town. Most got the details wrong, calling it haunted, radioactive, or cursed. The truth was far stranger and quieter. The artifacts were covered from the site: lunch tins, ration books, burned pages from a hymn book, all pointed to a single fact. Life had continued there, normally, until the very last moment. There were no signs of panic, no rushed departures. Even the school's chalkboards were found intact, covered in half-finished arithmetic. It was as though everyone had been told they'd come back, soon. That's how you erase a town completely. Not by violence, but with reassurance. Tell people it's temporary. Tell them it's for safety. And when they leave, don't tell them they can't return. Just never open the gates again. In 2010, a new generation of researchers began using ground-penetrating radar to map the substructure of the restricted zone. They found consistent grid patterns, remnants of roads, foundations, and basements, aligned precisely with pre-war survey data. It confirmed what many suspected. The town wasn't demolished. It was buried, intact, beneath layers of earth. One radar sweep even detected a hollow rectangular under what used to be the main square. Some believe it was a storm shelter. Others say it was a bunker built to house experimental materials. Either way, it was clear the valley had been modified, not abandoned. The soil samples told another story: traces of lead, uranium, and barium. Low levels, but unmistakably industrial. Someone had used Marrow Creek as a testing ground long after its people were gone. When local journalists tried to publish these findings, they received polite but firm letters from the Department of Energy, reminding them of restricted site protocols. The past, it seemed, was still classified. At night, hikers near the perimeter still report strange sounds. A low hum, rhythmic, mechanical, fading in and out like distant machinery. Acoustics experts explain it as wind patterns through valley hollows. But one veteran who worked near Oak Ridge smiled when asked about it. That's not the wind. That's the sound of an old project still remembering how to breathe. And maybe that's what Marrow Creek is. A living memory under lock and soil. A place where the dirt hums with what it used to be. Every era builds its secrets. Some are monuments, some are graves, and a few, like Marrow Creek, exist somewhere in between, half history, half apology. In the end, the architecture of absence tells a simple truth. Erasure is also construction. When the government buried the town, it didn't destroy it. It designed a new kind of monument, not to victory, but to silence. You can still trace that silence in the soil, in the symmetrical way nature reclaims streets, in how roots wrap themselves around forgotten bricks like vines around bones. Even decay follows the old geometry of human intent. Marrow Creek was meant to disappear, but it didn't. It adapted, became invisible, yet eternal.
It exists now as a kind of echo, one that hums in the wind, flickers in old documents, and breathes through the few who still whisper its name. Because America doesn't just build cities that rise, it builds cities that vanish. And sometimes, those are the ones that tell us the most about who we are. It began with a letter that arrived on a Thursday morning, thin, official, and cold as the winter air it was carried through. The residents of a small Tennessee valley, farmers, miners, mothers, school children, read the same words in disbelief. By order of the United States government, this area has been designated for national defense operations. You are to vacate your property within 30 days. There were no explanations, no name of the project, just a quiet signature and a seal stamped in black ink. Overnight, the valley became a ghost under construction. Roads filled with convoys, fences rose where orchards once bloomed, and men with clipboards replaced the sound of crickets. Locals began whispering to each other in church pews and diner booths. What are they building? By the time the Army Corps of Engineers arrived, the question itself was forbidden. The map was redrawn, and the name of the valley was erased. No one knew it yet, but a city had just been born, a city that would never officially exist. Months later, in a Washington basement, thick with the smell of old paper and ink, a clerk named Howard Bell sorted requisition forms that didn't quite make sense. They mentioned equipment, personnel, and restricted power usage, all routed through a front company with no listed address. Each document was marked with the same code name, Project Lattice. Curiosity was dangerous in those days, especially for a government employee. But Bell couldn't help tracing the pattern. The requisitions came from a location that matched the erased Tennessee Valley, the one nobody was supposed to mention. When he asked his supervisor, the man simply looked up, pale and stern. "Howard, if you value your pension, stop reading those files." And so the paper trail vanished behind a door marked confidential. But even sealed ink leaves fingerprints. By 1944, behind rows of barbed wire and warning signs, the valley had become something else entirely. Street lights burned through the night, powered by generators that hummed like 1,000 bees. Entire neighborhoods appeared from nothing, houses built from identical blueprints, all facing the same direction, all with blinds drawn tight. Workers arrived daily by bus, carrying lunch pails and government badges. They were machinists, chemists, secretaries, and janitors. None of them knew what the others were building. Inside the factories, dials turned, furnaces roared, and the air smelled faintly of ozone and hot metal. Every action was compartmentalized. Every conversation was watched. Even laughter felt rehearsed. One young engineer, Eleanor Vance, later recalled in a letter, declassified decades later, "We were told that our work would end the war, but I didn't know if we were saving lives or ending them. Every time I looked out the window, the sky looked different, as if it was hiding something." And maybe it was. When the war ended, the newspapers filled with headlines about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Only then did fragments of truth begin to leak through. Uranium, enrichment, the bomb. Yet the people of the valley didn't appear in those stories. Their contribution was erased beneath redactions and silence. Many tried to speak, to tell their families where they had worked or what they had seen, but agents came quietly to their doors, reminding them of the oath they had signed. National security, they said. Loose lips sink ships. Some believed the threat. Others, like Eleanor, simply couldn't bear the guilt. She wrote again in her journal in 1947, "I walk through the streets of the town and see no signs, no addresses, only numbers. We built light out of darkness and darkness out of light." And in that paradox, the story of the vanishing town still breathes, quietly beneath the soil of America, a place erased not by war, but by silence.